Today we're going to talk about the before you begin section of your pattern, what goes in it, why it's there, why you probably shouldn't be leaving it out of your pattern. That's a trend that I've seen, not a ton, but a little bit from some of the designers that I work with. A lot of times they'll like to leave this section out. That's not really a great idea, and we're going to talk about some of those reasons why. But before we jump in, make sure you stick around to the end because I've got a really cool announcement today that you're not going to want to miss. Alrighty, let's dive in. Before you begin section is usually like the first or second section of your pattern. It's usually on the first page, and it just kind of lists out a bunch of assumptions and information that honestly, most quilters are already going to know. They're not really even going to read this section and just skim through it, but you still need to have it there. You don't want to just exclude it because most people are already aware of it. And the reason you don't want to do that is because this section is not completely there for your reader. It's kind of 50% for them and 50% for you. This is actually like a disclosure almost. It protects you because a lot of people are going to skip over some of these assumptions that are baked into every single quilt pattern. And if they do, bad things happen, but you can't plan for all of that as a designer, right? You have to make some assumptions about width of fabric, about seam allowances, about all of these different things that are just so taken for granted in quilting. So this section just kind of baselines everything. And then if you have someone that just completely ignored those ground rules and they're like, wow, this pattern's horrible, like it's full of errors, I hate it, I should get a refund, this is awful, you can point to your before you begin section and be like, hey, did you pay attention to this? Well, no, that's your protection, right? It doesn't happen very often, but a lot of times, there's a lot of horrible customer service stories out there in the quilting industry, unfortunately. And so this is kind of your little layer of protection. It's unfortunate we have to put it in there, but you don't want to leave it out because it's really important that it is there just to keep you from being too exposed as a pattern designer. Alrighty, let's talk about the must-haves in this section. So the first one is really important and it's kind of a no-brainer, but read through all the instructions before beginning. Now, I'll be totally honest, I don't do that as a quilter myself, right? Because I'm confident in my skills and I know that whatever's in that pattern, I'm going to be able to handle. I'll still skim the whole thing, right? The first thing you do when you open a pattern is just kind of thumb through it and have a look to see if there's anything really crazy or that might make you want to not make the pattern. But instructing your reader to do this, make sure that they kind of go through that process and that they're aware of all of the things in the pattern so that when they get to those sections, they can't come back to you and be like, well, I didn't realize this had curves and I can't sew curves, so this pattern's useless to me, right? Did you read through the whole thing before beginning? Yes? Okay, then you should have known they were there and you can't blame me for that. The next one is width of fabric assumptions. Again, this is one of those quilting assumptions that you have to make it as a designer in order to be able to do all of your fabric calculations and quilt math, but you need to state what it is. And that's really important because if you're assuming 45-inch width of fabric, which some designers do, that's totally valid, you might end up with quite a few less strips than someone who's assuming 40 or 42 inches of width of fabric, right? You might end up being able to cut 2 or 3 extra pieces per strip, and that's going to add up, especially if you have a larger pattern like a queen size or king size quilt. Diagrams not to scale is another one. Very few of us are actually trying every single diagram, seam allowances, everything proportionate to each other. That's really hard to do and it makes writing the quilt pattern a nightmare. So I'm not advocating that you start doing this at all, but just disclaim that again so that if they're looking at the image and they're going, okay, well, proportionately, this is what I should be seeing. So I'm going to ignore all of the instructions about where to align my ruler. Not going to work. Diagrams are not to scale, right? Seam allowance assumptions are another really important one. Primarily, this is whether or not you need a scant 1/4 inch or just a regular 1/4 inch seam. There's not really a difference in quilting. That's a discussion for another time, but making sure that you state that it is a 1/4 inch seam allowance that's included in all of these pieces. And then if you're sewing really skinny stuff or really precise stuff, you also need to state that it's important to have a scant 1/4 inch seam. Some patterns it's going to matter more than others, but if it matters for your pattern, state that, make sure people are aware of it. The final thing that is definitely a must-have is any notes about kind of the assumptions in your fabric calculations. So if you've got a certain amount of excess or no excess, right, stating that its exact yardage is really, really, really important if you tend to calculate your fabric requirements that way. But if you're adding, an extra 10 inches per fabric requirement, you might want to state that so people can kind of make that decision as to if they want to buy extra or kind of cut it back a little bit because there's a little extra already padded in. Same thing with backing excess, saying that you've got 4 inches around or 2 inches around or no inches around each side of the quilt. That's really important, again, just so people are informed when they're purchasing fabric to decide whether or not they need to buy more than what is stated in the pattern based on their personal preferences. Alrighty, let's talk about some of the nice to haves in the before you begin section. Now these are totally optional. These are not like critically required like the last set, but things that are nice to have in there, any kinds of abbreviations used, right sides together, RST, half square triangles, HSTs with a fabric, like defining all of those definitions so you get it out of the way at the beginning and you don't have to keep repeating that in the pattern. Definitely add that to the before you begin section. It's much, much nicer reading it in that section than it is kind of throughout the quilt pattern. Tips and tricks. So if ironing before beginning really matters, it's a good thing to kind of add that note in there. Also starching before cutting, things like that. Just kind of tips and tricks that are not specific to your pattern, that are just kind of general quilting tips, but really make the process easier for your pattern. Things that you would recommend, really nice to have in the before you begin section. Anything that you don't want to repeat throughout the pattern. So things like pressing directions. If you've got like a global pressing direction where you're saying, press all seams open, press all seams to the dark side, press everything in the direction of the arrow. Those kinds of instructions you can add to the before you begin section. Again, this just alleviates you from having to add it at every single step in the pattern, shortens your pattern. And then any information about specialty rulers or templates if you need them. If your pattern can use a specialty ruler, definitely give them the information for that in the before you begin section, or even in a separate rulers section can be nice. And then if you've got templates, some basic instructions for how to print and cut those apart is really helpful. And that can all go in kind of this beginner header information. Again, these are things that most people, experienced quilters, will already know and just take for granted. This section isn't really important for them. But if you have a beginner quilter or someone who doesn't traditionally quilt, they kind of self-taught and they've developed their own methods, some of those things can get them into trouble with kind of the set of assumptions that most quilt patterns are written under. So those are the things that you want to kind of address in the before you begin section. Okay, so before I wrap up, let's talk about that little announcement that I teased at the beginning of this video. As of this morning, I am officially launching the beta version of a new software I've been developing for about 12 months now. It is called Mathless Quilts, and as the name would imply, it does all of the quilt math calculations for you in pattern writing, which I think is friggin' amazing because nobody likes to do math. So basically, you just put in some information about the shapes that you're using in your pattern, and then with a few clicks of a button, you can get all of the fabric requirements and cutting calculations right there for you instantly that you can just copy and paste into the pattern you're writing. It's going to be really, really powerful, and I'm so excited to finally be launching this thing because it's going to make the pattern writing process so much faster and so much more fun. The app is launching in beta today. Beta means that not all of the features that we have planned for this thing are there yet, but the core functionality is there, and it will help you calculate all of the fabric requirements and cutting instructions for block-based yardage quilts. Don't have fat quarter calculations in there yet, but they're coming in the next couple of weeks. If you join as a beta user today, you get to keep significantly reduced pricing for the lifetime of your subscription. The catch is that it's only available to the first 50 users. So as of this recording, I think I still have about 30 spots left. So if you're interested in getting in on that, make sure you sign up before they're all gone. All right, that's all I've got for you today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next week for Tech Tip Tuesday.